All right, so we've got to talk a little bit about what are we measuring and how we're going to measure it, right? So we have our topic, we have our research questions, we have our hypotheses as to what potentially could happen with respect to the research once we collect the data. But what are we collecting? We got to figure out what data are we collecting, how are we going to collect it, and what measurement tool we're going to use to collect that data. So let's say we're, measuring the effect of age on height, right? Well, age, we can measure that by days or years from birth date, right? That would be a measurement method. And then height would be using a ruler, basically, some form of a ruler in inches or feet or meters. You need to have a standardized method of measuring a variable, right? So we talked about the independent and dependent variable, and now what we're trying to do is how do we measure those variables that are of interest, and what are the things we need to think about? And so that's where the operational definition comes into play, defining, let's say, performance, right? Where one of the questions might be, what is the effect of fatigue on pilot performance? Well, how are you going to measure fatigue equally between participants, and how would you measure performance? Well, fatigue, you might operationally define it as fatigue on a fatigue scale that's validated by other research and conducted in a certain way. Performance could be a score on a performance scale for an IFR approach. So there are different ways to define your scale and methods of measurement. And so let's take a look at that. So one of the main purposes of research is that without measurement, there's no way to test our hypotheses. So we have our hypotheses, there is an effect on fatigue and performance. Okay, well now we need to measure those two things, those two variables somehow to see if there's a difference using statistical methods, right? And so what we need to do is assign numbers or symbols or characteristics or attributes to those variables that we're measuring. So like I said, height versus the height of a person. So that's the characteristic. The object is a person. How would we measure that? We would measure that with respect to a ruler, right? And so depending on your study, you will have to define your operational characteristics, right? Depending on what you're studying, you might have to try and find a scale that has been used either in previous studies or a scale that's available to you that you can use to measure a variable, right? To measure the concept that you're doing. So for example, that I have here, how would you measure thirst? If thirst was a variable, does thirst affect cognitive ability, right? Well, thirst is hard to quantify, but you could then say, well, I'm going to quantify thirst or operationally define thirst as the amount of water someone consumes, because I can measure that. I can measure that thirst is, someone's thirsty and they drink 8 cups of water in the sitting of 1 hour. They were extremely thirsty. They drink 4 cups after I give them, a chance to drink as much water as they'd like, depending on their thirst, and they only measure 4 cups. I could say that's medium thirst. And if they just drink 1 cup, maybe they're not really that low thirst, right? That's just an example conceptually. There are different scales out there that different people have made that are what's called valid and reliable, meaning that they have tested it, measured it, and made sure it's accurately measuring what operational definition may be defined. For example, IQ, right? The IQ tests that maybe you've seen, not the ones you find on Facebook or social media, but an actual IQ test measures intellectual capability, and you could use IQ for measuring intelligence, right? If intelligence is a variable that you have, how do I measure intelligence? Well, I've got to use a scale, and that might be, or a test, and that might be the IQ test, and that will give you a measurement of that variable to use for study. So what you want to do is define your dimensions, define the properties that you want to measure, and try and find the scale. Let's talk a little bit about scales, reliability, validity, and how do I choose a scale? How do I find a scale, right? So there are different types of scales. There's nominal, ordinal, interval, ratio scales. So if you think of nominal, that's just naming scales, identifying categories to a group. So male versus female would be a nominal scale. It's dichotomous, but it's also a nominal scale. You name or identify a male versus a female. Nationality would be a nominal scale. Pilot category, so private, instrument, commercial would be a nominal scale. And you can measure that. Based off, various, depending on what you're measuring, right? An ordinal scale would be rank order. So, what list, the class roster list or college football rankings? You typically don't use ordinal too much in terms of rankings, right? We don't use that much in quantitative studies. Interval would be anything that's measuring between 2 points. Examples would be temperature, that's measurable, right? Exam scores, that's measurable. Heading in degrees could be a performance, the change in heading degrees could be a performance scale or measurement, and that's an interval scale. And so that is interval. Ratio is very similar to interval in the sense that it has an absolute 0 point. So it starts at 0 and goes up to a score. So age starts at 0, income starts at 0, temperature will start at 0. It's also an interval scale. There's distance between the two. Age can have two distances or a grouping or things like that. And you could actually even change age into nominal in terms of grouping age into young or old, right? You could define young versus old in your group with a nominal scale. So depending on how you want to collect that data and use that data to be a scaled measurement for analysis is up to you on how you do that. Make sure you're collecting the data that you need. So make sure you define what data do I need to collect to answer my research question. That's why we did the hypothesis and research question first, and then we go from there. There's some rating and ranking scales that would be helpful to you. A Likert scale is something you've come across. The 0 to 5 scale, where 0 would be less agree or highly disagree, and then that's not a good example actually. A -3 to +3 scale would be a Likert scale when you're saying, what do you think about this option, for example? -3 would be highly disagree, 0 would be neutral, 3 would be agree. And based off that scale, depending on your questions or the scale that you use in that Likert scale, you might be able to determine to determine a measurement, a scale or performance, right? You could say, well, I want to know people's willingness to fly in an airplane that is remote controlled, right? That is, there are no pilots in the aircraft and I want them to fly. There is actually a willingness to fly scale that has been used in research that you can use. That's a Likert-based scale on people's opinions or ratings. And you can see if, depending on their age, let's say, depending on their income, depending on their education, and then relating that to the Likert scale might play a role with determining their willingness to fly, right? So that might be the dependent variable, and the independent variable might be age, or it might be education, or it might be a combination thereof. So that's how you would do that. And then you would categorize it in terms of male, female, college degree, income, that sort of a thing. A continuous variable, so there's categorical variable, that's categories, gender, degree type, pilot certificate type, and then there's continuous variables, so time, age. So does time play a role in, let's say, does time, number of seconds, let's say, have a role in performance, so reacting to a scenario. So time would be a variable, and then performance would be, or you could use time as a variable to measure performance. You could say you're putting someone in a simulator, and you're going to say that I'm measuring their performance as time to react to scenario once the scenario has been initiated, right? And so you have, let's say, 3 different scenarios, and let's say you're trying to measure the difference between a private pilot and a commercial pilot on a engine failure scenario, with other things associated with it. I'm just giving you an example. And as soon as you initiate the engine failure, you can calculate the time it takes to react, calculate the time to correctly perform the maneuvers, and then measure how many mistakes were made. And based off time and mistakes, you can see the difference between a private pilot versus a commercial pilot in terms of performance. You see where I'm going with that? That could give you an idea with continuous variables. What is a good measure? Well, a good measure is dependent on these 2 terms, validity and reliability. Is it valid? Are you actually measuring um, the measurement that you want, right? So if you used a let's say a shoe to measure height, let's say someone's height is 3 shoes, that's not really valid, is it? It's not really very clear. It's not really measuring what we want to measure. We want to measure inches or feet or centimeters, things like that. And usually content validity is done by subject matter experts. They have to agree, so a bunch of scientists would agree that a ruler that has a a set measurement scale in terms of feet and inches and centimeters would be a valid tool to use to measure height. If you're measuring things like willingness to fly, if you just made your own scale to measure, oh, how willing is someone to fly, that might not be valid because you want subject matter experts to all agree on that. And that's why you'll have to use literature review. That's why we go back to the literature to find scales. Not only are we doing the literature review to look at our topics, now we're going to use literature review on top of that to find scales and measurement tools that we can use similar to what's already out there that's valid and approved by other scientists. Reliability, first you must have validity. It's a good tool. A ruler is reliable because it's going to be able to measure to a certain extent each time roughly the same amount with low errors, right? So it needs to be able to do the same thing over and over again. Let's take an example of an IQ test, right? So let's say you made an IQ test that might be valid. People agree on it. It does measure IQ, but it doesn't measure it every single time. It's kind of inaccurate. It keeps having quite a large spread of scores between different people that have, let's say, happen to have the same IQ. That would be an unreliable test. It has to be consistent. So think of validity as it's actually correct, it's measuring it correctly, but then reliability is consistent. And there are different ways to get consistency or reliability. And so all this, you won't have to do validity and reliability. This is what is done to get validity and reliability. However, you want to find a scale that is considered valid and reliable, either through literature review or using things like time, using things like a ruler for measurement of distance. Things that measure heart rate, for example, would be a valid and reliable if you use the correct heart rate monitor, right? If you're using heart rate as a variable to measure, you would use a heart rate monitor that is accurate, like one of those medical heart rate monitors. Or you could even say that if you're going to use the same, say, Apple Watch through all your participants to measure heart rate, it should be valid and reliable. It's measuring the same thing over and over again consistently between different participants. So that's the importance of measuring your variables. I'm going to talk a little bit more about how to collect and giving some examples of different scales and measurements on the next video. What I wanted you to do is at least first start thinking about how are you going to start collecting the data and measurements of your variables with respect to what I talked about here. And the biggest thing is making sure you have a clear and clean operational definition and then finding scales that meet that operational definition of the variables that you have.